He thought he took everything, but my father left me one last secret hidden in plain sight, a place I had long forgotten. And what I found there wasn't just about an old building. It was about rebuilding a life from the ground up. If you've ever had to start over from nothing, if you've ever felt like you've lost it all, then stick around and hit that subscribe button. Because this story is for you, this is for us. The silence in the apartment was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a library or the hushed reverence of a church. It was an aggressive, empty silence that pressed in on my eardrums. It was the sound of a life vacuum-sealed and stored away, my life, or what was left of it. The final divorce decree had arrived in a crisp, manila envelope that felt heavier than it had any right to be. I'd signed my copy with a pen that was running out of ink, a small, pathetic detail that felt profoundly appropriate. Mark's signature was a confident, arrogant slash of black just like him. Done. Finished. Erased. I was sitting on the floor of a studio apartment that belonged to a friend of a friend. It smelled of stale coffee and someone else's laundry detergent. My worldly possessions were contained in 2 cardboard boxes and a duffel bag in the corner. A few changes of clothes, a handful of books he hadn't bothered to claim, a chipped coffee mug from my college days, and a framed photo of my dad and me taken when I was 10. In it, he's holding up a ridiculously small fish, and I'm laughing so hard my eyes are squeezed shut. I couldn't remember the last time I'd laughed like that. 2 years of mediation, of lawyers' offices that all smelled of lemon polish and quiet desperation, had bleached the color out of everything. He'd been so methodical. His lawyers were sharks in tailored suits, and mine was a tired goldfish swimming in circles. They'd argued that my contribution to our marriage was non-financial, a sterile, dismissive term for a decade of my life. The house was in his name. The savings accounts were his. The business we supposedly built together was, according to the paperwork, entirely his creation. I walked away with just enough to prove the system had technically worked. It was a settlement that felt more like a severance package for a job I'd been fired from. I traced the condensation on the window pane. Below, the city buzzed on, oblivious. Cars honked, people hurried along the sidewalks, their lives moving forward in straight, predictable lines. Mine felt like a shattered plate, the pieces scattered so far I couldn't imagine how they'd ever fit back together. Numbness was a mercy. It was a thick, gray blanket that muffled the edges of the panic that was always waiting, always ready to claw its way up my throat. I had spent so long fighting, then grieving, then just surviving, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to simply exist. The legal battle with Mark had been the final act in a long, slow tragedy. The first had been losing my dad a year before the separation began. He'd had a heart attack, sudden and swift, leaving a void that was as shocking as it was vast. He was my anchor, the one person whose belief in me was absolute. Without him, I'd drifted. Mark had seen that drift as an opportunity. He'd become my gravity, and I hadn't realized until it was too late that he was pulling me down, not holding me steady. He'd called my grief a drag, and my quiet sorrow unproductive. That's when I knew. The end had started long before the papers were filed. A fly buzzed against the glass, a frantic, tiny sound in the crushing quiet. I watched it, this small, stupid creature, so full of pointless energy. That was me, battering myself against a transparent wall, unable to see the way out. I pulled my knees to my chest, the rough denim of my jeans scratching my chin. What now? The question was a bottomless pit. I had no job, no home, and a savings account that was a joke. I was 32 years old, and I was starting from a point somewhere below zero. The shame of it was a physical weight, settling in my bones, making it hard to breathe. The institutional beige of the walls felt like they were closing in, a perfect visual metaphor for the life I was now living. It was a life of beige. Low-key, non-committal, forgettable. I closed my eyes, trying to summon my dad's face, but all I could see was Mark's triumphant smirk the last time we were in court. He'd won. He'd taken the past, and in doing so, he felt he'd taken my future too. And in the suffocating silence of that borrowed room, I was starting to believe he was right. I felt utterly and completely alone, adrift in a city that didn't care and a life that no longer felt like my own. A week later, another envelope arrived. This one was different. It was thick, cream-colored, and bore the embossed letterhead of a law firm I'd never heard of. Davies and Finch, attorneys at law. My first instinct was panic. Was it another bill? Another notice from Mark's legal team, tying up some forgotten loose end designed to inflict one final paper cut? My hand trembled as I tore it open, the sound of ripping paper unnaturally loud in the small room. The letter inside was brief and formal. It was addressed to me, Elara Vance. It informed me that their firm was the executor of a specific provision within the estate of my late father, Thomas Vance, a provision that had been kept separate from the main probate proceedings. I frowned, confused. My dad's estate had been settled over 2 years ago. There wasn't much to it. He wasn't a wealthy man. He'd had a small life insurance policy that barely covered his funeral costs and a mountain of medical debt. I'd walked away with his old truck, which I'd had to sell, and a box of his flannel shirts that still smelled faintly of sawdust and coffee. There was nothing else, I was sure of it, but the letter was insistent. It requested my presence at their office to finalize the transfer of a property held in a blind trust, which had been established for my benefit on my 18th birthday. The trust was now to be dissolved, and the asset transferred directly into my name. The asset was listed simply as the Blackwood Mill, 417 River Road, Northwood. The name stirred something in the deep, dusty attic of my memory. The Blackwood Mill. I remembered my dad mentioning it when I was a kid, always in a dismissive, almost wistful tone. It was the old ruin by the river, a place he'd point to from the car window on the rare occasions we drove out that way. A hulking stone skeleton covered in ivy, its water wheel long seized by rust and time. He'd bought it for a song years ago, he'd said, as a harebrained investment that never panned out. Mark and I had driven past it once. I'd pointed it out, a flicker of nostalgia in my chest. Mark had scoffed. "Look at that piece of junk," he'd said, not even slowing down. "Your dad had some weird ideas, it's an eyesore. They should tear it down." I'd felt a prickle of defensiveness, but I'd let it go. It was easier than arguing. According to this letter, that piece of junk was now mine, a blind trust. The phrase sounded clandestine, secretive. Why would my dad do that? Why hide it? The letter stated the property was owned outright with no mortgage. A tiny, fragile spark of hope flickered to life in my chest, and I immediately tried to smother it. Hope was dangerous. It was the currency of disappointment. This was probably a mistake, a clerical error. Or worse, the property was a liability, saddled with some catastrophic environmental issue or a tax bill that would swallow me whole. The letter did mention that property taxes were in arrears, a detail that felt like a cold splash of water. Of course, there was always a catch. Still, it was something, a thread. In a life that had completely unraveled, even a single thread was worth holding on to. I read the letter again, my fingers tracing the raised ink of the law firm's name, Davies and Finch. It was a solid, old-fashioned name. It sounded like my dad. He'd always preferred things that were built to last. I folded the letter and tucked it into the pocket of my jeans. The weight of it felt different from the divorce decree that had been an anchor pulling me down. This felt like a key. I just had no idea what lock it was meant to open, a ruin, a worthless crumbling mill. It seemed like a fitting inheritance for a woman whose life was also in ruins. Maybe that was the point. The offices of Davies and Finch were on the 3rd floor of an old brick building downtown, the kind with a real elevator operator, a stooped man with a gray uniform and a weary smile. The air inside smelled of old paper, leather, and rain. It was a world away from the gleaming, sterile offices of the family law attorneys I'd spent the last 2 years in. Davies was a man who seemed to have been carved from the same era as the building. He was in his late 60s, with a neatly trimmed white beard, spectacles perched on the end of his nose, and a suit that was well made but decades out of fashion. He didn't offer platitudes or small talk. He shook my hand with a dry, firm grip and gestured for me to sit. "Mrs. Vance, thank you for coming." His voice was a calm, low baritone. "I was your father's attorney for many years, a fine man, stubborn as a mule, but a fine man." A small, sad smile touched my lips. "That sounds like him." He nodded, opening a thick file on his desk. He was also a very shrewd man, and he was worried. "He set up this trust for you over 14 years ago, not long after you started dating your ex-husband." The words hung in the air. Davies didn't seem to notice my flinch. He was all business. He explained the mechanics of it in a steady, measured tone. The blind trust was designed to be completely separate from my personal finances. The mill was its only asset. My father had been the trustee, managing it and paying the taxes himself quietly for years. The purpose was simple, and I now realized devastatingly prescient. "He wanted to ensure you had something," Mr. Davies said, looking at me over his glasses. "Something that no one could ever touch. A place to stand," was how he put it, in case the ground ever fell out from under you. The ground hadn't just fallen out, it had been swallowed by a sinkhole. Tears pricked my eyes, hot and sharp. My dad had seen it. He'd seen the cracks in Mark's charm, the possessive glint in his eye that I had mistaken for devotion. He'd never said a word against him, not directly, but he had built this lifeboat just in case, and he'd never told me. The thought was both a comfort and a fresh wave of grief. He had protected me, even from beyond the grave. "The property is yours, free and clear," Mr. Davies continued, sliding a thick deed across the polished mahogany desk. "However, since his passing, the taxes have not been paid. You have 90 days to settle the amount with the county before they can initiate foreclosure proceedings." He named a figure that made the air leave my lungs. It wasn't astronomical, but for someone with $300 to their name, it might as well have been $1 million. There it was, the catch. He must have seen the despair on my face. His expression softened, just a fraction. "There is a standing offer on the property, Miss Vance, from a development corporation. It's been on the table for some time. Your father always refused it. It's a lowball offer, frankly, but it would be more than enough to cover the back taxes and leave you with a significant sum to start over. Sell it." The thought was a lifeline. I could sell this ruin I'd never seen, pay the debt, and have a cushion. I could get a real apartment, start looking for a job without the terror of impending homelessness breathing down my neck. It was the sensible thing to do. It was the easy thing. It was exactly what Mark would have done. "What did my dad want to do with it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Mr. Davies leaned back in his leather chair, a sound like a weary sigh. He never said, not in detail. He just said it had good bones. He loved that place. He used to say it was a piece of history that deserved a future. Good bones, a place to stand. The phrases echoed in my head. I looked down at the deed, my name typed in stark black letters, Alara Vance, owner. It was the first thing that had been truly mine in a decade. "I want to see it," I said, the words surprising me as much as they seemed to surprise him. "Before I make any decisions, I need to see it." He nodded slowly, a flicker of something that looked like approval in his eyes. He handed me a large, rusty iron key. "It'll be in the lockbox by the main gate. Your father put it there himself, said it was for you." I took the key. It was cold and heavy, a solid, tangible piece of a past I was only just beginning to understand. The drive out of the city was a slow exhale. I'd borrowed the last of my friend's goodwill in the form of her beat-up sedan, promising to have it back by nightfall. The urban sprawl gave way to suburbs, then to farmland, then finally to the dense rolling hills of the countryside I hadn't seen in years. The sky opened up, a vast pale blue canvas. The air coming through the open window smelled of damp earth and pine, a clean, sharp scent that scoured the city smog from my lungs. The turnoff for River Road was an unmarked gravel track that rattled the car's suspension. The road ran parallel to the Blackwood River, a wide, fast-moving ribbon of dark water, and then I saw it. The mill stood on a bend in the river, half hidden by a stand of ancient oak trees. Mark's description of it as an eyesore was both accurate and a profound understatement. It was a beautiful monster. 4 stories of hand-cut local granite, stained dark with a century of weather. The roof had partially collapsed on one side, leaving jagged rafters exposed like a broken ribcage. Ivy crept up the stone walls, a relentless green tide trying to pull the building back into the earth. The great water wheel was a skeleton of rust and rotten wood, hanging motionless over the churning water of the sluiceway. It wasn't just neglected, it was profoundly sad, a forgotten giant sleeping by the river. I parked the car and got out. The only sounds were the rush of the water and the wind whispering through the tall pines. It was a deep, resonant silence, completely different from the empty quiet of the apartment. This was a living silence, full of secrets. I found the lockbox, just as Mr. Davies had said. The iron key slid into the massive lock on the main doors. It took all my weight to turn it, the mechanism groaning in protest after years of disuse. The heavy oak door swung inward with a deep, sonorous groan, opening into a cavern of shadow and dust. The air inside was cool and thick, smelling of damp stone, decaying wood, and something else, a faint, metallic scent of oil and machinery. Sunlight streamed in through the grimy, broken panes of the high-arched windows, cutting shafts of golden light through the dusty air. Motes of dust danced in the beams like tiny glittering spirits. The main floor was a vast, open space dominated by the colossal silent machinery of the mill. Gears the size of tables, massive leather belts hanging in slack loops from the high ceiling, and the central grinding stones covered in a shroud of cobwebs. It was like stepping into the belly of a sleeping beast. I ran my hand over a giant iron flywheel, the metal cold and pitted beneath my fingers. The sheer scale of it was humbling. This place was built by people with strong backs and unwavering purpose. They weren't building for next quarter's profits. They were building for the next century. I walked through the space, my footsteps echoing in the immense quiet. In one corner, a set of rickety wooden stairs led up to the higher floors. In another, a smaller door led to what must have been the office. but I was drawn to a partitioned-off area near the back, where a single, intact window let in a pool of clear afternoon light. It was a workshop. My dad's workshop, I knew it instantly. A heavy wooden workbench stood against the far wall, covered in a neat layer of dust. Tools hung in orderly silhouettes on a pegboard above it. Wrenches, hammers, saws, each in its place. A half-finished birdhouse sat on the bench, a small, hopeful project abandoned mid-task. It was so him. Even in a place of decay, he had been trying to build something. My throat tightened. He had been here. He had stood in this light, breathed this air. It felt like he had just stepped out for a moment. On the corner of the workbench, beneath a dusty canvas cloth, was a gray metal box. It was an old Army surplus ammo can, heavy and solid, with a latch secured by a small, cheap padlock. My heart started to beat a little faster. This was it. This was something. I looked around the workshop, my eyes landing on a heavy-duty crowbar leaning against the wall. It felt like a desecration, but I had to know. I wedged the tip of the crowbar under the latch and pushed. The padlock snapped with a sharp crack, the sound echoing through the mill. I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed newspaper, was a thick bundle of letters, tied together with a piece of butcher's twine. They were addressed to me in my father's familiar, blocky handwriting, and underneath the letters, I saw the corner of a worn leather-bound journal. I sat down on a dusty crate, the ammo box on my lap. My hands were shaking as I untied the twine. The letters weren't dated on the outside, but they were thick, written on his preferred yellow legal paper. I pulled the one from the top of the stack. The paper was cool and smooth. I unfolded it, and his words, his voice filled the silent workshop. "My dearest Alara," it began, "if you are reading this, it means I'm gone. And it likely means that life has thrown you a curveball you didn't see coming. I'm sorry I'm not there to help you catch it. I'm sorry for so many things, but I hope this place, this old pile of rocks and memories, can be a comfort, or at least a start." I had to stop reading, my vision blurring with tears. I wiped them away angrily with the back of my hand and continued. "I bought this mill the year you were born. It was a wreck even then, but I saw something in it. Strength, honesty. It was built to do one thing. Take the power of the river and turn it into something useful. I always admired that. No pretense, just purpose. I never told you or your mother the real reason I held on to it. I let you think it was just a failed investment, a whim. The truth is, I saw it as an insurance policy. For you." The next paragraph made my blood run cold. "I never trusted him, Ellie, from the day you brought him home. I saw the way he looked at you, not like you were a person, but like you were a prize he had won. I saw the way he dismissed your thoughts, your dreams, turning them into little jokes. I saw it, and I said nothing. That is my deepest regret. I stayed quiet because I saw how happy you were, and I was a coward. I didn't want to be the reason that happiness ended. I didn't want to lose you. So instead of speaking up, I started quietly putting every spare dollar I had into this place, paying the taxes, fixing what I could, preparing it. This place was my silent argument against him, my testament. He builds his life on paper, on deals and debt. I wanted you to have something built on stone, something real. I had to put the letter down, a sob catching in my throat. It was too much. The validation, the grief, the shame that he had seen what I had refused to see for a decade. He hadn't been a quiet, passive father who disapproved of my choice. He had been a secret warrior, building me a fortress I never knew I needed. I picked up the letter again, my hands slick with sweat. "I don't know what your situation is, but I know you. You are stronger than you think. You have my heart. But you have your mother's fire. Don't let anyone extinguish it, least of all yourself. This place is yours. Sell it if you must. Walk away and never look back. There is no shame in that. But if you choose to stay, if you choose to fight for it, know that you are not alone. Everything you need to know is here. Look deeper, your loving dad." I cried then, not the quiet, choked-off tears of the past 2 years, but a storm of grief that shook my entire body. I cried for my dad, for the years he'd spent worrying in silence. I cried for the young woman I had been, so desperate to be loved that she had ignored every red flag. I cried for the decade I had lost, trying to be the person Mark wanted me to be, and I cried from a place of profound, earth-shattering gratitude for a father who had loved me enough to plan for my salvation, even if he could never speak it aloud. I sat there in the dusty workshop for what felt like hours, the sun slanting lower in the sky as the weight of his love settled over me like a warm, heavy blanket. The mill no longer looked like a ruin. It looked like a promise. But what was I supposed to do? The developer's offer loomed in my mind. It was a tangible escape route, cash in hand, a clean break. I could walk away from the taxes, the collapsed roof, the overwhelming task of it all. I could be sensible. But my father's words echoed in my ears, something built on stone. Mark's world was paper, this was real. The choice felt monumental, a fork in the road of my very soul. Take the money and run, or stay and fight for a pile of rocks by a river. Listen, if you've made it this far, thank you for being here. This part of the story, this moment of choice, is something I think a lot of us face in one way or another. It's that point where the world is screaming at you to take the easy way out, the sensible path, the one that leads to immediate relief. But something inside you, a promise you made, or a memory of someone you loved, is whispering for you to stand your ground and fight. It's the harder path, the one with no guarantees. If you know that feeling, if you've ever stood at that kind of crossroads, let me know in the comments below. Sharing these stories reminds us that we're not alone in the fight. Now, let's get back to the mill. I had to make a choice, and I was running out of time. The weight of that decision felt heavier than the crumbling stone walls around me, and I knew, deep down, that whatever I chose would define not just my future, but who I was going to become. After the emotional storm passed, a strange calm settled over me. I felt emptied out, but also clearer than I had in years. I folded the first letter carefully and placed it back in the box, then picked up the worn leather journal. The cover was soft and faded. Inside, the pages were filled with my dad's handwriting, but it wasn't a diary, it was a logbook. Years of entries, detailing his work on the mill. March 12. Replaced 3 rotten floorboards in the office. Found old shipping manifests from 1922. They were milling rye back then, May 5. Cleared the blockage in the south sluice gate. Water flow is strong, the sound is good. And then, an entry that made me stop. July 20. Met with the geologist again. He confirms the survey. The spring that feeds the aquifer under the property is unusually pure. Water rights are key. Don't forget, Tom, the water rights are the whole damn point. Water rights? I flipped through the pages, my excitement growing. It wasn't just a logbook, it was a manual. A treasure map. He documented every beam he inspected, every gear he oiled, every crumbling section of mortar he'd painstakingly repointed by hand. But he kept coming back to the river, the water, the mechanics of the sluice gates and turbines. The last entry was from 2 days before he died. The turbine quote came in, too high for now. But the potential is there, a constant source of power, clean, independent, a legacy for Ellie. Something that generates, not just sits. She'll know what to do. A legacy that generates. He wasn't just preserving a building, he was planning something. His first letter had said to look deeper. I stood up, my mind racing. The office. He'd mentioned replacing floorboards in the office. I left the workshop and crossed the main floor to the small, glass-paneled room that looked out over the river. The office was a wreck. A desk had collapsed into a pile of rotten wood, and old, water-damaged ledgers were piled in a corner, their pages fused into solid blocks. I scanned the floor. In the far corner, near the wall, one of the wide plank boards looked slightly different from the others. It was a shade lighter, and the nails holding it down looked newer. My heart hammered against my ribs. I knelt down, my fingers searching for a seam. I found a small notch on one side and pulled. The board lifted easily, revealing a dark hollow space beneath. It was a hidden compartment, lined with tin, and inside was another smaller metal box. This one wasn't locked. I lifted the lid. It wasn't filled with letters. It was filled with documents, neatly filed and labeled. There were original blueprints of the mill from 1890. There were geological surveys of the property, showing the bedrock and the underground aquifer my dad had mentioned. And then I saw the folder labeled Water Rights. I pulled it out and sat on the dusty floor, my back against the wall. The documents were dense and full of legal jargon, but the gist was clear. When the mill was built, it was granted primary riparian rights to that section of the Blackwood River. Because it was established before the State Water Board was formed, its rights were grandfathered in, giving it priority over almost any other user on the river. In an era of plentiful water, it was a minor legal footnote. But now, as the legal notice attached to the front of the file explained, the state was in the middle of a prolonged drought. Water was becoming the new gold. The document detailed my father's meticulous work in preserving and legally reaffirming these rights over the years. He had protected them like a dragon guarding a hoard, and at the bottom of the pile was a more recent folder. It contained engineering schematics, cost analyses, and correspondence with a company that specialized in small-scale hydroelectric power. My dad's plan laid out in black and white. He wasn't just fixing a ruin, he was planning to bring it back to life. He wanted to restore the old turbine, using the mill's historic water rights to generate clean electricity, enough to power the mill and potentially sell the surplus back to the grid. It was brilliant, it was visionary, and it was the reason the developers wanted the land. It wasn't the 5 acres of scrubland they were after. It was the water. They wanted to buy the mill, decommission it, and seize the water rights to feed the massive, thirsty resort and golf course they were planning to build 5 miles upstream. They weren't making a lowball offer on a ruin. They were trying to steal a gold mine. The phone in my pocket buzzed, making me jump. It was Mr. Davies, Alara, he said, his voice sounding tinny and distant. I'm glad I reached you. I've just had a call from the lawyers for Northwood Developments. They're aware the property has been transferred to you. They're formally reissuing their offer, and they've increased it substantially. He named a new number, and this time it was one that made me gasp. It was life-changing money, enough to not just start over, but to live comfortably for years. Enough to make all the pain and struggle of the divorce disappear into a haze of financial security. It was the ultimate easy way out. They want an answer by the end of the week, Mr. Davies said. They made it clear that if you refuse, they will move to have the county expedite the foreclosure proceedings for the back taxes. They're going to play hardball. I looked around the dusty office, at the blueprints spread across my lap, at the light glinting off the powerful river outside. I could hear my dad's voice from the journal, something that generates, not just sits. Mark had taught me the value of money. He had worshipped it. A life with him had been about accumulating things, about appearances, about the bottom line. My dad was trying to teach me the value of purpose. He had left me a choice, not between a ruin and a fortune, but between 2 different futures, 2 different versions of myself. One who took the cash and let his legacy be bulldozed, and one who stayed, fought, and tried to build something that mattered. Alara, are you there? Mr. Davies asked, a note of concern in his voice. I stood up, brushing the dust from my jeans. I looked at my reflection in the grimy window pane, a pale, tired-looking woman who looked nothing like the girl in the photo with her dad. But maybe she could be, maybe she still was. I'm here, I said, my voice clear and steady. Please inform the lawyers for Northwood Developments that their offer is rejected. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Are you certain? Mr. Davies asked. They will make this very difficult for you. I watched a hawk circle high above the river, riding the currents of the wind. It looked free. I'm certain, I said. Tell them the mill is not for sale. I ended the call before he could argue. The consequence was immediate and invisible. I couldn't see the lawyers making their calls or the paperwork being filed, but I could feel it. A declaration of war had been made. The fight was on, but for the first time in a very long time, I felt ready for it. I wasn't just defending a pile of rocks. I was defending my father's dream. I was defending my own chance at a future. I had a place to stand, and it was built on solid stone. That night, I didn't drive back to the city. I couldn't. Leaving the mill felt like abandoning a part of myself. I slept in the car, wrapped in an old blanket from the trunk. It was a cold, uncomfortable night, but every time I woke, I could hear the steady rush of the river, a constant, powerful heartbeat in the darkness. It sounded like hope. The next morning, I drove into the small town of Northwood. It was the kind of town that time had mostly forgotten, with a single main street, a diner, a hardware store, and a post office. It felt a world away from the anonymous crush of the city. My first stop was the town hall, a small brick building with a squeaky front door. I used the last of my emergency credit to pay a portion of the back taxes, enough to show intent, to buy myself a little time. The woman at the counter, a kindly lady with a cloud of white hair, gave me a sympathetic look. The old Blackwood Mill, she said, tapping her pen on the counter. Haven't seen anyone do anything with that place in years. My granddaddy used to work there. Said it was the heart of this town once. Her words were another small gift, another piece of the story. This place wasn't just my legacy. It belonged to the history of this town, too. My next stop was the hardware store. It was a wonderland of organized chaos, smelling of sawdust, fertilizer, and fresh paint. An older man with calloused hands and a friendly face was behind the counter. Can I help you? He asked. I took a deep breath. I hope so. My name is Alara Vance. I own the old mill. His eyebrows shot up. Tom Vance's girl? Well, I'll be. You look just like him around the eyes. I'm George. Knew your dad for years. He used to come in here. Buy the strangest things. Bags of mortar. Specialty oils, copper wire. Always had some project going on out there. I felt a lump form in my throat. He left it to me, I said quietly. I'm going to try and fix it up. George leaned on the counter, a serious expression on his face. Heard Northwood Developments is trying to snatch it up. They're vultures, that bunch. Don't let them bully you. Your dad loved that place. He saw what it could be. He then spent the next hour walking me through the store, pointing out the tools I would need. explaining the difference between masonry sealants, giving me a crash course in basic structural repair. He sold me a heavy-duty respirator, work gloves, a new crowbar, and 5 contractor-grade trash bags at a steep discount. "Call it a welcome to the fight discount," he said with a wink. I spent the next few weeks in a blur of motion. I officially gave up the apartment in the city, moving my 2 boxes of possessions into the mill's old workshop. I bought a cheap air mattress and a camp stove. It was primitive, cold, and uncomfortable, but it was mine. Every day, I worked. I started with the cleanup, a task that felt as much emotional as it was physical. I filled bag after bag with debris, old nests, and rotten wood. I was sweeping away not just the dust of decades, but the residue of my old life. With every swing of a hammer, every pry of a crowbar, I felt a little bit of my own strength returning. I was sore and exhausted every night, but it was a good kind of tired. It was the ache of creation, not the weariness of defeat. I started a blog, a simple online journal where I documented the process. I posted photos of the mill, of the old machinery, of my father's journal. I wrote the story of his secret gift, of the developers, of the fight to save a piece of history and build a source of clean energy. I didn't expect much, but then something amazing happened. The story started to spread. A local newspaper picked it up. Then a regional historical society. People from Northwood started stopping by, offering a helping hand, a thermos of hot coffee, or just words of encouragement. The woman from the town hall organized a small bake sale to raise money for the tax fund. George from the hardware store showed up one Saturday with his son and 2 other men, and they spent the entire day helping me secure the collapsed section of the roof with heavy tarps, a temporary but vital fix before winter. I learned that inheritance wasn't a passive thing. It wasn't just something you were given. It was a choice you made every single day, a choice to accept the gift, to honor the intention behind it, and to carry the responsibility forward. Mark had taken the things we had accumulated. The house, the cars, the money, they were just things, hollow shells. But my father had left me something infinitely more valuable. He had left me a purpose. He had left me a fight that was worth fighting. The mill was more than a building. It was a metaphor for my own life. It was old, it was damaged, and it had been abandoned. But its foundation was solid stone, and its heart, the river, was still beating with immense power. It just needed someone to believe in it again. It needed someone to see the potential beneath the dust and decay. Standing on the rickety second-floor landing one evening, watching the sunset paint the river in strokes of orange and purple, I realized I wasn't just rebuilding the mill. I was rebuilding myself, stone by stone. Months have passed since that first day I walked through the mill's groaning doors. The legal battle with Northwood Developments is a slow, grinding war of paperwork and deadlines, but we're holding them off. A pro bono environmental law group caught wind of the story and took on my case, arguing that the mill's historic water rights are a public trust. The crowdfunding for the restoration has gained steady momentum, fueled by people from all over the country who were inspired by the story of a father's love and a daughter's fight. We raised enough to pay off the back taxes in full, a victory that felt as momentous as any court ruling. The mill itself is changing. The tarps have been replaced by a new, sturdy section of roof, funded by a grant from the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Volunteers have helped me replace dozens of broken window panes, and for the first time in 50 years, the entire building is watertight. Light now fills the main floor, illuminating the beautiful, powerful machinery that is waiting patiently to be brought back to life. It's still a monumental task. The restoration of the turbine is a complex and expensive undertaking that will take years. There are days when the sheer scale of the project feels overwhelming, when the dust seems endless and my bank account is terrifyingly low. There are days when I feel that old familiar flicker of doubt, the whisper that I'm in over my head. But then I walk outside and stand by the river. I listen to the constant soothing rush of the water and I feel the solid ground beneath my feet. I am no longer the numb, broken person who sat on the floor of that borrowed apartment. That woman is a ghost. I am a builder now. I am a steward of a legacy. I have a community around me, a family forged not by blood but by a shared purpose. George still gives me discounts, and the town hall clerk brings me a casserole every Tuesday. We are the guardians of the Blackwood Mill. My father left me a ruin, but he gave me a home. He left me a burden, but he gave me a reason to get up every morning. He taught me that the most valuable things in life aren't the ones you own, but the ones you fight to protect. The heaviest burdens can, in time, become our strongest foundations. The mill, like me, looked broken from the outside, but the structure was sound. It just needed a second chance. My story with this mill is really just beginning. It's a long and winding road, but it's my road, and it's a story about rebuilding. If you're rebuilding something in your own life right now, your career, your confidence, a relationship, your sense of self, I want you to know that it is possible. It is slow, and it is hard, and it takes more strength than you think you have. But you have it. Subscribe to the channel if you want to follow the rest of this journey, to see this old mill come back to life. And please, share a piece of your own story in the comments. Tell me what you are rebuilding. This channel, this community, is a place for people who understand what it means to build something that lasts. Thank you for listening.